The door to the Sable Creek saloon flew open so hard it cracked against the inside wall, and every man at every table turned to look. Elsie Gentry stood in the frame with the late afternoon sun burning orange behind her, her medical bag clutched in one hand and a folded contract in the other, and the expression on her face was not the kind a woman wore when she had come to beg. "You lied to me," she said, and her voice cut through the piano music and the clinking glasses like a blade through silk. "You told me your ranch was solvent. You told me the deed was clean. And now I find out you used it as collateral on a loan you cannot pay, and the bank is going to take it before the week is out." Stephen Wells sat at the far end of the bar, a whiskey glass in his hand that he had not lifted to his lips in 30 seconds. He was a tall man, broad across the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same rough limestone as the bluffs north of town. He had dark hair that curled slightly at the temples from the heat, and his eyes were the color of storm clouds settling over open country. Every man in the room knew who he was. Every man knew what he owned. And not one of them had ever seen him look the way he looked right now, which was something very close to caught. "Miss Gentry," he said, and his voice was low and even, the voice of a man trained to control things. "This is not the place." "You do not get to decide what place this is," she said, walking into the room without breaking stride, her boots striking the floorboards with the kind of authority that stopped the piano player mid-chord. "Because if you had been honest with me 3 days ago when I saved your foreman's wife and that baby, and you offered me the Southwest grazing parcel as payment, you would have known I would eventually find out the truth. I always find out the truth, Mr. Wells. It is the one thing in this world I am exceptionally good at, along with keeping people alive." She stopped 4 feet from him and set the contract on the bar between them with a sound like a judge dropping a gavel. "Now," she said, "you are going to sit there and listen, because I have a deal that saves your ranch, saves my land rights, and gives us both something we want. Or you can keep staring at me like I just walked out of a dream you are embarrassed about, and we can both lose everything." The silence in the saloon was absolute. And Stephen Wells, who had ridden through the worst blizzard of 1882 without flinching, who had broken 6 horses before breakfast and buried his father in the ground with his own hands, set down his glass very slowly and turned to face her fully. "I am listening," he said. It had not started here, of course. It had started 3 weeks before, on a night so cold the stars looked brittle, when a man had pounded on Elsie Gentry's door at 2 in the morning with terror in his fists. Elsie had come to Sable Creek, Colorado in the spring of 1883, which was a fact that most of the town's men had found either amusing or alarming, and occasionally both. She was 28 years old, which was neither young nor old by the standards of the frontier, and she had come with 2 mules, a trunk full of medical instruments, and a reputation that had arrived slightly ahead of her in the form of a letter from Dr. Ambrose Culver of Denver, who had trained her personally and called her, in writing, the most gifted practitioner of obstetric medicine he had encountered in 30 years of practice. The men of Sable Creek had not known what obstetric meant, and when the general store owner's wife explained it to them in terms they understood, half of them decided immediately that Elsie Gentry was either a saint or a scandal, and they weren't entirely sure there was a difference. She had set up her practice in the small adobe building on the south end of town that had previously served as a tack room, and she had cleaned it herself, whitewashed the walls herself, hung her instruments herself, and placed a hand-painted sign above the door that read, "E. Gentry, Midwife and Frontier Physician." She had no husband. She had never had one. This was the detail that the town's gossips could not get past, not the sign, not the instruments, not even the fact that she sometimes wore trousers under her skirt when she rode out to remote homesteads in the dark. She had dark red hair that she kept braided and pinned, and green eyes that were sharp enough that more than one person had mentioned they felt diagnosed simply by being looked at. She was not tall, but she carried herself with the kind of posture that made rooms feel smaller around her, and she had a directness to her manner of speaking that some people found refreshing, and some people found insufferable, depending almost entirely on whether they were wrong about something. She was almost always right. In the 6 months she had been in Sable Creek, she had delivered 11 babies without losing a single mother or child, had correctly diagnosed a case of typhoid fever that Dr. Herman Schieffer, who was 70 years old and practiced 20 miles west, had called a stomach complaint, and had removed a deeply infected splinter from the hand of a cattle driver that would have cost him the hand had she not intervened. She charged a sliding scale based on what people could pay. She accepted trade goods, livestock, parcels of land, and once, memorably, 3 months of fence repair from a homesteader named Carlson who had nothing else to offer and whose wife had labored for 42 hours before Elsie had turned that baby with her hands and brought it safely into the world. She kept meticulous records. She read every medical journal she could order by post. She had taught herself French so she could read a book on puerperal fever that had not yet been translated, and she had implemented hand-washing protocols in every delivery. She attended that the other women in town thought were peculiar, and the baby's survival rates made obviously correct. She was, in short, a woman who had made herself exceptional through discipline, study, and a refusal to believe that any frontier was too hard or any problem too complicated to solve with enough knowledge and enough nerve. And she had been managing perfectly well, entirely on her own, until the night Hector Ruiz rode his horse half to death to reach her door. Hector was the foreman on the Wells Ranch, which occupied the largest stretch of land east of Sable Creek, a sprawling operation of cattle and horses that Stephen Wells had built up from the 50 acres his father had homesteaded in 1861. Hector was a compact, serious man of 35 with a wife named Rosa who had been expecting their 3rd child for the past 9 months, and when he appeared at Elsie's door with his hat in his hands and his eyes showing white around the edges, she already knew before he spoke that something was wrong beyond the ordinary complications of labor. "She has been laboring since yesterday noon," he said. Elsie was already putting on her coat. "Is there bleeding?" "Some. Not terrible, but she is not progressing and she is very tired, Miss Gentry. She is so tired." His voice broke on the last word, and Elsie registered that information with the clinical part of her mind, while the human part of her responded to his fear with a gentleness she kept available for exactly these moments. "Saddle the 2nd horse," she said. "We are leaving in 4 minutes." She had ridden 11 miles in the dark with Hector Ruiz, through a cold that made the air feel like breathing glass, and she had arrived at the Wells Ranch bunkhouse just before 3 in the morning, to find Rosa lying in the narrow bed with her sister-in-law, pressing a damp cloth to her forehead, and the particular quality of exhaustion in her face that Elsie recognized as a woman approaching the outer limit of what a body can endure. She had examined Rosa quickly and thoroughly, and the assessment she made in the next 2 minutes had required everything she knew. The baby was positioned obliquely, neither head down nor breech, but sideways, a transverse lie, which was among the most dangerous of malpresentations, and which, left unaddressed, would kill both mother and child with absolute certainty. Dr. Schieffer, had he been there, would have shaken his head and prepared them for the worst. Elsie did not believe in the worst unless she had personally exhausted every alternative. She had asked Rosa's sister-in-law to hold Rosa's hand and talk to her, and she had explained to Rosa in clear, steady Spanish what she was about to do and why, and she had performed the external cephalic version entirely by feel, both hands pressing with precisely calibrated force through Rosa's abdomen to rotate the baby from a transverse position to a vertex one, a procedure she had read about in 3 separate texts, and practiced on a medical model in Denver, and performed twice before. Both times successfully, the baby had turned. 40 minutes later, a boy had entered the world with a voice like a calf discovering it had lungs, and Rosa Ruiz had wept with a gratitude so pure it made the room feel sacred. That was when Stephen Wells had appeared in the doorway. She had not seen him until that moment, had not known he was even on the property. She understood later that he had ridden back from the far pasture as soon as one of his hands had ridden out to tell him what was happening, and he had been standing in the yard when Elsie arrived, watching, though she had not noticed him in the dark and the cold. He had followed the situation from outside the bunkhouse, unwilling to intrude but unable to leave. He was not a man who typically needed to be introduced. He had the kind of physical presence that announced itself, broad and still and certain, like a feature of the landscape. But Elsie had been so entirely focused on Rosa and the baby that when he stepped into the bunkhouse doorway after the birth, she looked up at him with an expression of mild professional assessment rather than the impressed recognition most people showed when they first saw Stephen Wells. "Is she all right?" he asked. "She is going to be fine," Elsie said, and went back to what she was doing. He had stood in the doorway for another moment, watching her move with the calm efficiency of someone who has never once doubted that they belong in the room they are in. Then he had looked at the baby, pink and furious in the bunkhouse lamplight, and he had looked at Rosa, exhausted and tearful and alive, and something had shifted in his expression that he probably did not realize was visible. Hector had clasped his son and then clasped Stephen's hand and said, "She saved them. She saved them both, patron." Stephen had looked at Elsie again. "What do I owe you?" She had named her price. A portion of the southwest grazing parcel, 12 acres along the creek line, where she had been wanting to build a proper clinic with a room for difficult deliveries and a separate area for recovery. The land was good land, creek-watered and level, and she had been trying to acquire it by legitimate means for months. She had already spoken to the bank about it. Stephen had agreed without hesitation, and she had thought that was the end of it. It had not been the end of it. She had been at the county record's office 2 days later, filing a preliminary inquiry about the parcel, when the clerk, a nervous young man named Davies who sweated regardless of the temperature, had let slip, in the way that nervous people let things slip when they are trying to be helpful, and are instead being catastrophically unhelpful, that the southwest parcel of the Wells property was listed as collateral on a note held by the First Territorial Bank of Pueblo. The note was significant. The note was, in fact, for a sum that made Elsie's heart do a very specific kind of arithmetic, the kind where you add up the components of a bad situation, and the total comes out worse than you expected. The loan had been taken out 14 months ago, presumably to cover the cost of the winter that had killed half the cattle on every ranch in the territory. The maturity date was 31 days away. The amount outstanding was $11,000. The Wells Ranch, for all its size and reputation, was drowning. Elsie had stood very still in the record's office for exactly the time it took her to understand the full shape of the problem. Then she had walked to the bank, where a man named Prescott, who wore a suit that cost more than most families in Sable Creek made in a year, had confirmed the information with the kind of professionally sympathetic tone that people use when they are not actually sympathetic at all. "Mr. Wells has been unable to restructure the debt," Prescott said. "The bank has been patient, but patience has a limit." "What is the bank's preference?" Elsie asked. "Foreclosure or repayment?" Prescott had blinked. "Repayment, naturally. We are not in the business of managing cattle operations. Then you would accept a structured arrangement if the debt could be serviced." "In theory, but Mr. Wells has no assets sufficient to offer as additional security, and no income stream in the near term that would allow restructuring." Elsie had thanked him with a politeness that was entirely professional, and walked out of the bank with the particular feeling she got when a problem began to show her its solution, faint and partial like a path through fog, but real. She had gone home and she had thought for the rest of that day and most of the following night, and by morning she had a plan. It was audacious, and it was complicated, and it required Stephen Wells to swallow a considerable amount of pride, which she was not at all sure he was capable of, but it was the only plan that worked. She had done the mathematics 7 different ways and they all came out the same. which was why she had walked into the Sable Creek saloon in front of 20 witnesses and put the contract on the bar and told him to listen. He listened. She laid it out plainly, the way she laid out medical procedures for anxious patients, clear steps in a logical sequence, no embellishment, no softening. The Wells Ranch had a debt it could not service. The First Territorial Bank wanted repayment, not a ranch. Elsie had a relationship with the Denver Medical Society, whose charitable foundation funded frontier medical facilities in exchange for land deeds held in trust, and she had already, over the previous 24 hours, sent a telegraph to Dr. Culver in Denver and received a reply that confirmed the foundation's interest in a proposal. The proposal was this: Elsie would deed the 12 Creekline acres, once transferred to her, to the Medical Society Trust. The Medical Society, in exchange, would provide a grant of $4,000 toward the construction of a frontier clinic on that land. Stephen Wells would use the grant funds, combined with the summer cattle revenue and a negotiated restructuring with the bank, to service the debt. The bank would get its interest payments on a new schedule. Stephen would keep the ranch. The Medical Society would have its clinic on land it held in trust, but that would benefit the entire community. And Elsie would have her clinic built properly with materials that would last. Everyone would get something real. Nobody would get everything they wanted. That was the nature of a good barter. The saloon was still silent. Stephen Wells picked up the contract. He read it. He was not a fast reader, but he was a careful one, and Elsie stood quietly while he went through every clause, because she had written it to be read carefully and every line held up under scrutiny. When he finished, he set it down. "You did this in one day," he said. "2 days," she said. "I drafted the framework the day before yesterday and sent the telegraph yesterday morning. You sent a telegraph to Denver on my behalf before you told me what you were doing." "I sent a telegraph to Denver on behalf of a problem I identified that had a solution attached to it," she said. "I did not commit you to anything. You are holding the contract. You can put it back on the bar and walk away, and I will take my 12 acres somewhere else and build my clinic, and you can figure out how to find $11,000 in 31 days without my help. That is your right." He looked at her for a long time with those storm cloud eyes, and she held his gaze without difficulty because she had been holding the gaze of people who underestimated her for her entire adult life, and she had never once looked away first. "Why?" he said at last. "Why what? Why would you do this? You already had the land agreement. I already owed you the parcel. You could have just taken it and filed the deed and let the bank take the rest of the ranch and walked away with your 12 acres and your clinic, and not spent 2 days engineering a rescue for someone who had just, apparently, given you land he didn't fully have the right to give." It was a fair question. She had expected it. "Because the land is worth more to me with a functioning ranch around it than with a foreclosed property," she said. "Because the community needs the ranch as much as it needs the clinic. Because Rosa Ruiz and her children live in that bunkhouse, and I did not spend 40 minutes turning a baby in the middle of the night to watch their home be stripped away. And because," she paused just briefly, "you made an honest mistake. You offered me something you believed you could give. I do not punish people for honest mistakes if I can solve the problem instead." Stephen Wells was quiet for the length of time it took a candle on the bar to drip 3 times. Then he picked up the pen that the bartender had placed there without being asked, because the bartender was a man of excellent instincts, and he signed the contract. He looked up at her. "You want to get out of this saloon," he said. "I think we need to talk about the specifics." "That," Elsie said, "is the most sensible thing you have said since I walked in here." They walked out together into the late afternoon, and the men in the saloon watched them go, and the piano player, after a moment's thoughtful silence, started playing again. The town of Sable Creek had an opinion about most things, and its opinion about Elsie Gentry walking out of the saloon with Stephen Wells was formed, discussed, revised, and distributed with impressive efficiency. By the time Elsie and Stephen had reached the end of the main street and turned toward the small office that served as the town's only law and records combined, At least 4 separate women had watched them from windows, and 3 men had nudged each other at doorways. The gossip was understandable. Stephen Wells was the largest landowner in the county and had been stubbornly single for as long as anyone could remember. He had been engaged once, years ago, to a woman from Santa Fe who had come and seen the ranch and the isolation and the work of it, and had gone back to Santa Fe with her trunk and her regrets within a single season. Since then he had been the subject of considerable matrimonial interest from the eligible women of the territory, and he had deflected every approach with a polite remoteness that eventually discouraged persistence. He was not unkind. He paid his hands well and treated them fairly. He donated to the church even though he rarely attended it. He had organized the town's response to the blizzard of 1882 with the calm competence of a general, and there was not a family within 20 miles that had not received either beef or firewood or both from the Wells Ranch that winter. He was respected. He was reliable. He was also, in the private assessment of most people who knew him, profoundly alone in a way that he had organized his entire life around not showing. Elsie knew none of this as she walked beside him. Or rather, she knew the outline of it the way you know the outline of any man who has built himself into a fortress, from the outside, by the shape of the walls. What she knew in more precise terms was that he was quiet in a way that was thoughtful rather than dull, that he walked with a deliberateness that suggested a man who paid attention to where he was going, and that he had read every word of that contract and understood it, which told her more about the quality of his mind than 6 hours of conversation would have. They sat in the records office with the door open for propriety and the clerk Davies hovering anxiously at his desk, and they went through the plan line by line. Stephen asked good questions. He pushed back on the timeline once, and she explained the bank's date constraints, and he accepted the correction without ego. He questioned the foundation's motivations, and she explained the medical society's broader goals in the territory, and he nodded slowly, working through the implications. He was, she realized with a mild surprise she did not let show, exactly as intelligent as she was, just differently trained. Where she had built her knowledge through books and study and clinical practice, he had built his through land and labor and the particular education of making consequential decisions in hard conditions for 20 years. Different architectures, equal foundations. The summer cattle revenue, he said after a silence. You listed it in the plan. How did you know what it would be? I talked to Hector Ruiz this morning, she said. He blinked. You talked to my foreman. He was bringing Rosa some broth from the main house. We spoke for about 20 minutes while I checked on her. He is very forthcoming when he trusts someone. He trusts you. Rosa trusts me, she said simply. That is the same thing. Stephen was quiet again, and in that silence something changed very slightly in the way he was looking at her. It was not the first change she had noticed. The first had been in the saloon when he had picked up the contract, and it had been a shift from the guarded surprise of a man whose assumptions were being rearranged. This was something different. This was closer to the expression of someone realizing that the territory they are in is larger than the map suggested. They finished going through the plan. Elsie would bring the signed contract to the bank the following morning. Davies would file the land transfer paperwork. She would send a follow-up telegraph to Dr. Culver confirming Wells's agreement. Stephen would arrange a meeting with Prescott at the bank to begin the restructuring conversation. I will need to be there, she said, about the bank meeting. I know, he said. She looked at him. You are not going to argue that it is unnecessary. You built the plan. It would be like building a bridge and then letting someone else explain to the engineer how the river works. He paused. I may have ideas about how things work in this town that you don't have, but I don't know what you know, so yes, you should be there. It was, in its quiet way, the most significant thing he had said to her so far. She filed it in the part of her mind where she kept information that required later consideration. She stood. He stood. They walked out of the records office into the early evening, and the quality of the light had changed while they were inside. going from the hard orange of late afternoon to a softer gold that made everything look briefly gentle. "Miss Gentry," he said on the street. She turned. "Thank you," he said. "That is a genuine and complete thing I am saying, not a polite thing." She studied him for a moment the way she studied a symptom she had not seen before, with careful attention and without judgment. "I know the difference," she said. "You are welcome." She walked back to her clinic. She did not look back, but she was aware, with a precision that she found slightly inconvenient, that he stood on the street and watched her go. The meeting with the bank happened 3 days later, and it was the kind of meeting that people who have never been in a negotiation imagine as straightforward, and people who have been in many negotiations know to be a continuous exercise in controlled confrontation. Prescott had not expected Elsie. He had prepared his position with Stephen Wells specifically in mind, which meant he had prepared for a man who was proud and somewhat financially desperate and could be pressed. He had not prepared for a woman who arrived with a letter from the Denver Medical Society's foundation director, a copy of the proposed grant terms, and a folder of comparable restructuring agreements from 3 other territorial banks that she had requested by mail over the past week and received by expedited post. Prescott looked at the folder. "Where did you obtain these?" he said. "From the banks that provided them," Elsie said pleasantly. "Which they did when I wrote to explain that I was surveying current practices for a paper on frontier finance and medical infrastructure. The First Territorial Bank of Pueblo does not want to be the institution that turns down a grant-funded medical facility in the interest of a foreclosure that nets them less than the outstanding principal. That would be a very difficult story to tell the board in Denver." Prescott's professionally sympathetic expression became, for a moment, something less polished. Stephen, seated to Elsie's left, said nothing. He was watching her the way you watch a craftsperson work when you are still learning the craft, attentively, without interruption. They restructured the loan. The terms Elsie negotiated were not perfectly everything she had aimed for. They never were. But they were better than the bank had offered and better than Stephen could have gotten alone. And when they walked out of the bank 2 hours later with a signed agreement that gave the ranch a 12-month restructuring period at a manageable interest rate, Stephen stood on the bank's wooden steps in the afternoon heat and said nothing for a long moment. "You told the bank you were writing a paper," he said. "I said I was surveying practices for a paper," Elsie said. "I did not specify whose paper or when it would be written. I do intend to write it eventually. I find frontier finance extremely interesting." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was adjacent to one, a sound of genuine surprise and something like delight, the kind that escapes a person before they have decided whether to let it out. "You are remarkable," he said. He said it simply, without flourish, the way he would state that the sky was clear or that the ground was dry as a plain observation of fact. She looked at him steadily. "I know what I can do," she said. "I have always known. The rest of the world has been slower to catch up. It has caught up now," he said. And there was something in his voice when he said it, something direct and unhidden, that was not at all about the bank meeting. She felt it. She was not a woman who denied things to herself that were clearly true. She felt the warmth of it, specific and real, and she noted it with the same careful attention she gave to everything that mattered. She said, "We should celebrate. There is coffee at my clinic. It is not much of a celebration, but it is what I have on a weekday afternoon." "That sounds fine," he said. They walked to the clinic, and it was the first time he had been inside, and he stood in the doorway the way he had stood in the bunkhouse doorway on the night of the birth, taking it in with a quiet thoroughness. The shelves of instruments and medicines, the table covered in clean linen, the stacks of medical journals in French and English, the diagrams on the wall, anatomical and precise, the file cabinet where she kept her patient records, organized by date and condition. The second room she was already using for minor procedures, smaller than she needed it to be, which was the whole reason she wanted the clinic built properly. "This is what you have done in 6 months," he said. "The organization was the first month," she said, measuring coffee into the pot with the efficiency of long habit. "The rest is ongoing." He sat at the small table she used for consultations, and he looked around the room for a while in the particular way of a man who is genuinely seeing something for the first time and doesn't want to miss any of it. Then he looked at her. "Tell me about Denver," he said. It was an invitation, not a demand. She heard the difference. She told him. Not all of it, not in order, but the pieces that mattered. The years studying under Dr. Culver, who had seen what she could do when she was 19 and working in the charity hospital, and had offered to train her properly, which had meant years of reading everything and practicing constantly, and going to places where help was desperately needed and learning from what she found there. The time in Kansas, where she had worked for 18 months in a community of homesteaders and had delivered 47 babies and lost one mother to a hemorrhage that she had done everything possible to stop, which was the loss that she still thought about in the dark, the one that had made her learn more and practice more and never stop seeking better methods. The years of working toward a place where she could build something permanent, not just follow need around the frontier, but create a fixed point of medical competence that women in this part of the territory could count on. Sable Creek was deliberate, she said. I chose it, the demographics, the geography, the need. I spent 3 months researching before I came. You researched the town before moving here, he said. Of course. Most people just arrive. Most people leave again, she said. I intend to stay. He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. My father arrived, he said. Just arrived. Looked at the land and said, that is where we will be. He had nothing. He built from nothing. He died knowing he had built something real. Is that why you didn't let the bank take it, she said, even when it would have been the financially rational choice? He looked at her. The storm cloud eyes were very direct. You think it would have been financially rational? If you had walked away before the debt was due, you might have kept some liquidity, started smaller somewhere else. It would not have been rational, he said. It would have been giving up something my father died for. There is no number you can put on that. She understood. She thought of the loss in Kansas, the mother she had not been able to save, and the way that loss had made her more rather than less committed to the work. Some things you carry forward because putting them down would mean the weight had been for nothing. No, she agreed. There is not. They sat in the small room with the coffee going cold between them, and the conversation moved the way good conversations move when two intelligent people have stopped performing for each other and are simply talking, from one real thing to the next. He told her about the ranch, the particular problems of running cattle on Colorado land, the way the winters came and the springs flooded, and the summers dried things out in ways that made a man feel like the land was actively testing him. She told him about the medical literature and what the new research was saying about the causes of childbed fever, and how she had implemented preventive protocols that she was increasingly certain were making a measurable difference. He asked questions about the medicine that were not polite questions but genuine ones, the kind that pushed past the surface into the actual mechanism of things, and she answered them with the depth they deserved and was aware, as she did so, that this was not a thing that happened often. Most people asked about medicine the way they asked about weather, making conversation. This man was actually listening to the answers. The afternoon went to evening without either of them entirely noticing. When he finally stood to leave, he stood slowly, as if he was reluctant to close the distance between sitting in this room and walking out into the world where they were again simply acquaintances with a business arrangement. Dinner, he said. Tomorrow, not as a thank you, as a question. She looked at him, and the word he had chosen was so careful and deliberate and specific that she had to admire it. Not an assumption, not a command, a question. Yes, she said. Tomorrow. He nodded once, the way he did things completely without excess, and he walked out into the dark. The dinner was at the hotel dining room, which was the most formal establishment Sable Creek offered and was, by frontier standards, genuinely pleasant, with cloth napkins and a cook who had trained in St. Louis and whose biscuits were the best thing within 100 miles. It was also, as both of them were fully aware, spectacularly public, which meant that by the following morning the entire town would know that Stephen Wells and Elsie Gentry had sat across from each other for 2 hours and talked in the way that people talk when they are concentrating very hard on the other person and not particularly concerned about anything else. What the town could not know from the outside was the content of those 2 hours. He asked her about her family, and she told him about her parents who had been schoolteachers in Ohio and who had encouraged her relentlessly when they could see the direction of her mind, and who had died within a year of each other when she was 23. Her mother first from a cancer that no one at the time had the tools to address, and her father 6 months later from a grief that had turned physical. She had inherited a modest sum and used it to fund her training, which she did not regret and had never resented, though the loss of them was a thing she still felt in quiet moments. He listened to this with an attention that was, she noted, not pitying but present. He did not rush to offer comfort or to redirect away from sadness. He simply received what she told him. He told her about his mother, who had come west from Virginia with his father, and had been what he called the actual engineer of the ranch, meaning the one who had managed the money and the logistics and the relationships while his father had managed the land and the cattle. She had died of a fever when Stephen was 17, in a year when there was no doctor within reach, and he had watched his father break in a way that he had never fully repaired. He said this without excess emotion but also without the artificially controlled flatness of a man suppressing something. He said it the way you talk about something that happened long enough ago to be integrated rather than raw. That is part of why you agreed to the clinic, Elsie said. He considered this. Part of it, he said. The rest is that you were right and the plan was good. You can acknowledge both things. I can and I do, he said. Somewhere around the second cup of coffee, the conversation shifted from the past to the present in the way it does when two people are moving toward each other and have begun to realize they are doing it. He asked what she found most difficult about the work, and she said honestly that it was the isolation, not the physical isolation but the professional one, the fact that she was doing work that was important and demanding and frequently extraordinary, and that there was no one in her daily life who could understand the specifics of it from the inside. The women I serve trust me, she said. That means a great deal, but there is a difference between being trusted and being understood. Yes, he said, and the way he said it carried more weight than the single word usually bears. She looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup. You know that difference. I have run this ranch since my father died, he said. I have made every decision alone for 12 years. Every person who depends on the ranch depends on me making good decisions, which means there is no one inside the operation I can be uncertain with. The uncertainty has to go somewhere, but it has to go somewhere private. He paused. That is its own kind of isolation. She set her cup down. Is it lonely? She asked it plainly because she was a plain-speaking woman and she thought he deserved a plain question. He met her eyes. Yes, he said, it is. The word sat between them, honest and unhidden, and Elsie felt something shift in her chest that was not medical in nature and was not a professional assessment. It was simpler than both of those things and more complicated than almost anything else. I am not an easy person to be close to, she said. I should tell you that straightforwardly since we appear to be doing that. How so? I am direct to the point of being blunt. I have opinions I have formed through careful study, and I hold them firmly unless someone presents a better argument. I am not interested in being managed or handled or told what is appropriate for a woman to do or think or want. I have built an entirely independent life and I am proud of it and I have no intention of dismantling it for any reason, including she held his gaze romantic ones. He looked at her steadily, not intimidated, not amused, something else. That is not what independence requires, he said. Sometimes men say that and mean something different. I know they do, he said. I am not saying it to get a result. I am saying it because I built my own thing on my own terms and I would not want someone to take it apart either. I would not ask that of someone I respected. Do you respect me? She said, not as a challenge, as a genuine question. "More than almost anyone I have ever met," he said. "And I met you 9 days ago," she smiled. It was not the polite social smile she had available when needed. It was the real one, smaller and more sudden and entirely involuntary. "That is a useful thing to know," she said. He smiled back. And the hotel dining room with its cloth napkins and its St. Louis biscuits felt, for a moment, like the whole world had made itself small and warm and exactly right. The weeks that followed were busy ones. The restructuring agreement needed to be filed, and the bank correspondence needed to be sent, and the Medical Society Foundation needed to be formally engaged, and the land transfer needed to be recorded, and the preliminary drawings for the clinic needed to be made. Elsie managed most of this with the methodical efficiency that characterized everything she did, and Stephen contributed the local knowledge and the relationships with the building suppliers and the practical questions that she would not have known to ask without his input. They worked together well. This was not something either of them had expected to discover with such clear certainty so quickly, but it was simply and plainly true. Where she was analytical and structured, he was pragmatic and experienced, and the gap between those two modes of thinking turned out to be fertile ground rather than a barrier. She would propose something and he would say, "Yes, but consider the weather in March," and she would incorporate the adjustment, and the plan would be better. He would suggest something and she would say, "That works logistically, but the costs will exceed the budget by 20%, and he would rethink, and the solution would improve. They had dinner twice a week, sometimes at the hotel and sometimes at the ranch, where Rosa Ruiz, recovered and glowing with the particular radiance of new motherhood, cooked extravagantly and watched them with undisguised approval, and occasionally made comments in Spanish that she clearly knew Elsie could understand, and that consistently made Hector Ruiz tell her to stop. The baby, named Miguel, was thriving. He had the loud opinions and the sturdy build of a child who had arrived in difficult circumstances and intended to make up for it. Elsie checked on him every 2 weeks with the systematic care she brought to all her patients. Rosa had begun helping her, in the informal way of frontier women who find a need and fill it, sitting with laboring women when Elsie needed an extra pair of hands, and translating for the Spanish-speaking families in the county who had previously had no medical access at all. Stephen watched Elsie with Miguel during one of these visits, and had the expression of a man who is seeing something he had not let himself think about and is now finding it difficult to unthink. She noticed. She noticed most things. He did not say anything that day. He was, she had learned, a man who needed time to formulate the things that mattered, who was not slow but who was careful, and who would rather say less than risk saying something imprecise about something real. He said it 3 weeks later on an evening in late June when they had walked to the creek line after dinner at the ranch and stood looking at the land where the clinic would be built, the foundation already staked out, the lumber already ordered, the pale late light turning the creek water into something that looked like melted copper. "I want to ask you something," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You knew what I was going to ask." "I have been watching you work your way toward it for 2.5 weeks," she said. "You are very deliberate when it matters. I have come to find it one of the more admirable things about you, for the record." He looked at the water for a moment. "I love you," he said. "I want you to know that clearly before I ask anything, because the question should not exist without the love first. I love the way your mind works, and I love the way you are in the world, and I love that you saved my ranch, and then told me straightforwardly that you had done it partly for yourself, because that kind of honesty is the rarest thing I know. I love you." Elsie was quiet for a moment, and the creek ran over its stones in the particular soft, persistent way of water that has been moving for a very long time and intends to keep moving. "That is a complete and well-organized declaration," she said. "I worked on it," he admitted. "I know." She turned to look at him. "I love you too. I want you to know that that is not a reciprocal courtesy. I have been exactly as deliberate as you have, and I have come to the same conclusion through my own independent process, which seems appropriate." He looked at her, and the storm clouds in his eyes had something else in them now, something warmer and less guarded than she had ever seen there, the expression of a man who has been alone in a fort for a long time and has finally, of his own will, unlocked the gate. "Would you marry me?" he said. She looked at the staked-out foundation of the clinic. She looked at the creek. She looked at him. "On one condition," she said. He waited. "The clinic is mine. The practice is mine. I keep the deed on the creek parcel and continue my arrangement with the medical society. I keep my patients and my records and my methods and my autonomy over my medical decisions, entirely and without consultation or permission required. The marriage is a partnership of equals in every matter that touches us both, and in the matters that are mine alone, it is simply mine." "Yes," he said. "You agree without negotiating." "There is nothing to negotiate," he said. "Those are your terms for being yourself. I would not marry anyone less than all of you." She felt the warmth of that settle through her the way good news settles, not with a rush but with a solidity, the feeling of something becoming true that you hoped was possible. "Then yes," she said, "I will marry you." He kissed her then, on the bank of the creek in the copper light of early summer, with the staked-out foundation of her clinic visible behind her, and the whole long stretch of his land visible ahead. And it was not a tentative or questioning kiss, but a certain one, the kind that two deliberate people exchange when they are both entirely sure. They were married in September of 1883 by the Justice of the Peace, with Hector and Rosa Ruiz as witnesses, and most of Sable Creek in attendance at the reception afterward, which was held at the ranch, and involved a great deal of Rosa's cooking and Stephen's careful selection of a California wine that he had ordered specifically for the occasion, and which the general store owner's wife called the finest thing she had tasted since Chicago. Elsie wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from Denver, the color of sage, which suited her dark red hair, and which she had cut and sewn with the same precise attention she brought to everything. She wore her hair down for the first and possibly last time in public memory, and more than one guest reported later that Stephen Wells had looked at her when she walked toward him in the yard of the ranch, as if the rest of the occasion had become briefly inessential. The clinic opened in November. It was a small but solid building of good timber with proper windows and a stone foundation, and 2 rooms for treatment, and a small attached room for recovery. Elsie furnished it with equipment she had been ordering by mail for months, some of it standard and some of it the newest available, the kind that Dr. Culver had sent to her personally with a note that said he was prouder of her work than of anything else he had done in medicine. Rosa Ruiz became her formal assistant, paid a real wage from the Medical Society grant funds, and the 2 women ran the clinic with an efficiency that the county's women recognized and relied on, and that the county's men slowly, sometimes grudgingly, and eventually completely accepted as one of the fundamental features of the landscape. The winter of 1883 to 1884 was hard, as Colorado winters were, but it was different from the previous ones. The ranch had the restructuring in place, and the summer cattle revenue had been good, better than the plan had projected, partly because Stephen had made a sharp sale of a contract herd to a buyer in Pueblo that Elsie had helped him negotiate by writing the contract language herself, which had left the buyer's lawyer slightly baffled and considerably outmaneuvered. The debt was being serviced. The ranch was stable. They lived in the main house on the ranch, which was large enough for the 2 of them, and the future they had discussed without pressure, but with clarity. Elsie rode into town every weekday except Sunday. She kept records and read journals and wrote letters to the medical society and occasionally to other physicians, and she continued to be the person in the county who knew the most about keeping mothers and babies alive, which was not a small thing to be. She was also, in the privacy of the home she shared with Stephen, simply happy in a way that she had not known was available to her in quite this particular form. Not the happiness of professional success, which she had known for years and valued completely. Something that lived alongside that. That was not the same thing but was equally real. The happiness of being known by another person, specifically and carefully and without the edges being smoothed away. Stephen knew her edges. He had seen them from the first saloon confrontation, the directness, the precision, the refusal to soften a truth for the sake of comfort. He did not ask her to smooth them. He appreciated them, sometimes explicitly and sometimes just by the way he listened when she said something sharp and considered it rather than deflecting. In the spring of 1884, Elsie discovered she was pregnant. She told Stephen on a Tuesday evening while they were sitting at the kitchen table going over the ranch's spring expense calculations, which was exactly the kind of context in which she would tell him something important, directly and without staging. He put down his pencil and looked at her, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen before and had not known she needed to see until she was looking at it, which was a joy so immediate and unguarded and completely undefended that it made her chest ache with the beauty of it. "Are you happy about it?" he said first, not assuming, asking. "Yes," she said. And then, because she loved him and he had earned the full version, "I am very happy about it. I was not certain I wanted children when I was younger and alone. I am certain now." He came around the table and held her in a way that was entirely different from the way he held her under ordinary circumstances, carefully, the way you hold something precious that is also completely capable of handling itself. "We will need to think about your schedule," he said. "I have already been thinking about it," she said. "Rosa can take on more of the routine appointments through the third trimester. I will continue all deliveries until it becomes physically impractical, which will be later than you are probably comfortable with, and I need you to trust my clinical judgment about that." "I trust your clinical judgment about everything," he said. "I just reserve the right to be worried." "That is allowed," she said. "Good." He held her for another moment. "Good," he said again, very quietly, in a completely different tone, the tone of a man talking to himself about the shape of his life. Their son was born in December of 1884, in the ranch house, delivered by Rosa Ruiz under Elsie's very specific instructions, because Elsie herself had determined at 36 weeks that the delivery was straightforward, and that she could guide it even in her own condition, a decision that Stephen had accepted with the look of a man who understood that arguing would be both futile and wrong. The boy was large and vocal, and had his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes, a combination that Rosa declared unfairly beautiful. They named him James Daniel Wells, James for Elsie's father and Daniel for Stephen's, and from his first hours in the world, he had the particular quality of presence that suggests a person who intends to take up their full space. Stephen held his son for the first time in the chair beside the bed where Elsie was resting, and the expression on his face was something that Elsie kept in her memory with the care she kept her most important records, available for retrieval on the days when the world felt difficult, or the work felt heavy, or the frontier felt very large and very hard. Hector Ruiz came to see the baby 2 days later and shook Stephen's hand with the grip of a man who is genuinely moved and wept without any embarrassment, because Hector Ruiz was a man who felt things completely. "Miguel needs to meet him," Rosa said, holding James with the ease of an experienced mother. "They will be friends. They will probably get into a great deal of trouble together," Elsie said from the bed. "Yes," Rosa agreed cheerfully. "That is what friends are for." The spring of 1885 brought two things that required significant attention. The first was a diphtheria outbreak in the western settlements, which Elsie addressed with the focused intensity of a physician who has both the knowledge and the infrastructure to act. She worked with the county's other doctors, including the old Dr. Schieffer, who had revised his initial skepticism into something that stopped just short of admiration, to implement a containment response that drew on everything she knew about infection control and community health. It was exhausting and demanding and occasionally frightening work, and it reduced the outbreak's death toll to a fraction of what similar outbreaks had produced in the region in previous years. The Medical Society Foundation, upon reviewing her detailed report and outcome data, approved an additional grant for expanded facilities and equipment, and wrote a letter to Elsie that Dr. Culver read aloud at the Society's annual meeting in Denver to an audience of 60 physicians, describing her work as a model for frontier medical practice. She did not attend the meeting. James was 4 months old and she was needed at home, but she read the letter 3 times and kept it in her files. The second thing the spring of 1885 brought was Prescott, the bank manager, who arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday morning with what he described as an important business matter. Elsie happened to be home that morning and happened to sit at the table when Prescott sat down, and Prescott, who had learned something from the restructuring meeting, did not this time make the error of directing his remarks exclusively to Stephen. The matter was this. The First Territorial Bank was reconsidering its relationship with the larger Wells land holdings, and there was a proposal being floated at the board level to call several of the associated notes early. Elsie looked at Prescott. On what basis? Market conditions, Prescott said. Which market conditions specifically, she said. Because the cattle market is stable, the restructuring has been serviced on schedule for 16 months, and the property values in this county have increased since the clinic was established, which I can document. Prescott blinked. The board has concerns about regional exposure. The board has concerns, she said, or the board has received an offer from another party who wants to acquire this land and is using the bank as a mechanism to force a sale. Those are different problems with different solutions. Prescott was quiet. Stephen, beside her, said, "Is there a competing buyer?" More silence. "I see," Elsie said. She picked up her pen. "I am going to write a letter to the Banking Supervision Division of the Colorado Territorial Government, and I am going to describe this meeting in precise detail, including the timeline relative to the offer you have apparently received, and the fact that a current note holder in good standing is being threatened with early call without a documented legitimate basis. I have several contacts in the territorial government from the medical society work. They are interested in financial practices that harm frontier communities." She looked at Prescott steadily. "Or we can discuss what the board actually needs in order to decline the competing offer, which I assume is a financial justification, and I can provide one." Prescott looked at Stephen, who said nothing, and looked back with the expression of a man who is watching a chess match from the side of the board and is entirely clear about who is winning. "A financial justification would be preferable," Prescott said, in a voice that had become considerably quieter. She provided one. It took 2 hours and drew on the ranch's improved revenue figures, the increased property values she had cited, the economic impact of the clinic on the surrounding community, and a projection she built on the spot from the cattle market data she had been tracking because she found it interesting, and because data about things that affected her family's stability was, in her view, always worth knowing. The board declined the competing offer. Afterward, Stephen poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her and said, "Who made that offer?" "I do not know yet," she said, "but I will find out." She did find out, through the methodical process of asking the right questions of the right people, 3 days later. It was a land speculator from Denver named Hartwell, who had been acquiring distressed ranch properties across 3 counties and consolidating them for resale. He had made similar moves against 2 other ranches in the area, and both had been lost. Elsie wrote the letter she had threatened to write, describing the pattern across all 3 cases, and sent copies to the territorial government, to the Denver newspapers, and to the medical society, whose board members included several people of significant political influence. She also helped the 2 affected ranch families document their situations for a collective complaint. Hartwell's acquisition strategy became considerably more difficult in the following months. One of the 2 lost ranches was eventually partially restored through a legal process that Elsie helped initiate. The other was not recoverable, and that was a loss she could not undo, and she felt the weight of it in the way she felt all the losses she could not prevent, as information for how to do better next time. By the summer of 1885, the Wells Ranch was not merely stable. It was flourishing, which was a word that the ranching men of the territory applied to very few operations, and never to ones that had been as close to the edge as Wells had been 2 years before. The restructured debt was on track to be fully paid within the original extension period. The cattle herd had been rebuilt to pre-blizzard levels. Stephen had made 2 smart land purchases with the restored revenue, small adjacent parcels that completed the eastern boundary of the property, and gave the ranch access to a second water source. He had made those decisions in consultation with Elsie, not because he needed her permission, but because she was his partner and her mind was good and he knew it, and because, after nearly 2 years of building something together, he had no interest in going back to doing things alone. The clinic had delivered 63 babies in its first 18 months of full operation, with no maternal deaths, a record that Elsie tracked obsessively, and that she had presented, in written form, to a gathering of territorial physicians in Colorado Springs in April, which had been the first time a woman had presented at such a gathering, a fact that had caused considerable discussion beforehand, and given the quality of the data, somewhat less discussion afterward. James was walking by Christmas of 1885, and was, by all accounts, exactly what a first child is when both parents are exceptionally intelligent and somewhat strong-willed, charming, curious, and entirely determined to go in the direction he had decided on regardless of what the environment suggested. Rosa Ruiz told Elsie privately that he was going to be a problem in the absolute best sense. Elsie told her that she was aware and was looking forward to it. Miguel Ruiz, who was 2 years older than James, had already taken on the role of older brother with the seriousness of a person who understands that this responsibility is permanent, and the 2 boys spent their early years doing the things that boys on ranches do, which is largely a sustained and enthusiastic investigation into how many ways the world can be interacted with before an adult intervenes. In the fall of 1886, Elsie found herself pregnant again, a discovery she made between patients on a Wednesday morning, and received with the calm of a woman who has had time to know exactly what she wants her life to hold. This time she told Stephen that evening, and the joy on his face was the same as it had been the first time, unguarded and complete, with the addition of a certainty that the first time had not quite had, the certainty of a man who knows now what before he only hoped. "Boy or girl, what do you think?" he asked. "I think it does not matter at all," she said. "No," he agreed. "Not at all." Their daughter was born in March of 1887, on a morning when the snow was still on the ground, but the light had the particular quality that suggests spring is thinking about arriving. She was small and dark-haired, and had from the first hour the expression of someone who is paying very close attention. They named her Clara Ruth Wells, Clara for no particular tradition except that it suited her, and Ruth for Rosa's formal name, which was Rosaria, which contained it, and which Rosa received with a display of emotion that required several minutes and a great deal of coffee to resolve. James regarded his sister with the wariness of a 2-year-old encountering something unexpected, and then, within 48 hours, with the territorial certainty of a child who has decided that this small person is his specific responsibility to protect and introduce to everything interesting. The winter of 1887 was the hardest they had faced since Elsie had come to Sable Creek, not in weather terms but in other ways. There was a scarlet fever outbreak in the northern settlements that kept Elsie away from home for stretches that were hard on everyone, including her. She managed it with the same focused thoroughness she brought to every crisis, but the separation from her children and from Stephen was a different kind of cost than the professional ones, and she felt it. Stephen managed the ranch and the children with Hector's help and Rosa's, and did not once suggest that the work was too much or that she should come home before the crisis was resolved. He wrote to her during the week she was in the northern settlements, letters that were not long but were very specific, details about James and Clara that she wanted to know, and practical updates about the ranch that she found comforting. And at the end of each letter, a single sentence that was entirely personal and that she kept in a small box in her medical bag that she did not open in front of other people. When the outbreak was contained and she came home, he was in the yard when she rode up, and he lifted her off the horse the way you lift someone you have been worried about and are relieved to have in your arms, completely and without self-consciousness, and held her for a long time without saying anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said. By 1889, the clinic had become the central institution of women's health in the county, a fact that the county commissioners had officially acknowledged in a resolution that Elsie had not lobbied for, and had accepted with a graciousness that was entirely genuine, because the acknowledgement was not for her personally but for the work, and the work deserved to be acknowledged. Dr. Schieffer had retired, and his replacement, a young physician named Garrett from Cincinnati, had come to the clinic on his third day in the territory specifically to meet Elsie, and had spent 4 hours asking her questions about frontier practice that were intelligent and humble in the best sense, the questions of a person who knows they have things to learn. She had liked him immediately. They had established a referral relationship that served the county well. James started school in the fall of 1889, in the schoolhouse that had been built on the north end of town 2 years before. He was 5 years old and had the vocabulary of a child whose parents read to him constantly, and his teacher, a woman named Miss Farrell who had come from Kansas, sent home a note at the end of the first week that said he was the most opinionated child she had encountered in 12 years of teaching and that she meant this as a compliment. Elsie showed Stephen the note. He read it and said, "I cannot imagine where he gets it." She looked at him. "From both of us," he said, "clearly from both of us." Clara at 2 was already a person of fixed preferences and extraordinary stubbornness, which were entirely appropriate qualities in a Wells woman, and which Rosa Ruiz greeted with the delight of someone who sees the future very clearly. In the late spring of 1890, Elsie received a letter from the Denver Medical Society inviting her to submit a paper for their annual journal. The subject she proposed was the implementation of infection control protocols in frontier delivery settings and their measurable effect on maternal and neonatal outcomes, which was the paper she had been accumulating data for over 7 years of practice. She wrote it over 3 months, between patients and after the children were in bed, in the kitchen of the ranch house with Stephen sometimes reading at the table beside her, and sometimes asleep in the chair by the window, and sometimes bringing her coffee without being asked at hours that required no comment. The paper was accepted. It was published in the Society's journal in the fall of 1890, and subsequently cited by 2 physicians in Eastern papers, and by a British medical journal that ran a summary. Dr. Culver wrote to her that he had read it aloud again, as he had done with her earlier report, and that this time the audience had been larger and the silence when he finished had lasted longer. She was 35 years old. She had been in Sable Creek for 7 years. She had delivered 104 babies without a single maternal death, a record that would not be fully appreciated in its statistical significance for many more decades, but that she understood completely, and that was, in its quiet way, one of the great achievements in that part of the frontier's medical history. She was, in all the ways that counted, exactly where she had decided to be, in the work she had chosen with the people she had chosen, and the life she had built by the sustained application of intelligence and will and the occasional audacious barter. The morning she had the letter confirming the paper's citation in the British journal, she rode out to the creek line on the horse Stephen had given her for their 2nd anniversary, a gray mare of exceptional temperament named Remedy, and she stood looking at the clinic in the clear October light, the solid timber walls and the good windows, and the sign above the door that now read E. Gentry WELLS, midwife and frontier physician, and she felt the particular satisfaction of a person who has looked at a problem, found a solution, and lived long enough to see the solution become the landscape. Stephen found her there an hour later, because he generally knew where she was when she needed to think, having paid 7 years of careful attention to the patterns of a woman who valued her solitude and who loved to be found by him specifically. He stood beside her and looked at the clinic. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. "James told Clara this morning that she could not have the last biscuit because she was too small to eat it," he said. She threw it at him. Elsie smiled. "Good. He ate the pieces." Of course he did. They stood together for a while in the October morning, with the creek running steady over its stones and the clinic solid on its foundation, and the whole stretch of the ranch visible in the distance. And the air had the smell that fall air has in Colorado, cold and clean, and faintly of something burning somewhere in the way of wood smoke in a neighbor's chimney 2 miles off. "I was thinking," Stephen said, in the particular tone that meant he had been thinking for some time and had arrived at something he was ready to say. "Yes," she said. "Miguel Ruiz is 12, James is 6. In about 10 years, if those two have the instincts for it, there might be something worth building between the next generation of both families." He paused. "The ranch could expand, the clinic could expand. This area is going to keep growing. The railroad will come through eventually." She looked at him. "You are thinking 10 years ahead." "I was thinking 20, he said, "but I started at 10 to be conservative." She turned back to the clinic. "I have been thinking 20 as well," she said. "A proper hospital. Not frontier medicine, actual medicine with full facilities. There is enough population in the county now to justify it. The medical society would fund half if I can secure the land and present the need data, which I have." He nodded slowly. "The east parcel is county land. It could be petitioned." "I know. I spoke to the county commissioner last month." He looked at her, and the expression in his storm cloud eyes was the one she had first seen fully that evening on the creek bank when he had said he loved her, warm and unguarded, the expression of a man who has never once in 7 years of marriage stopped being genuinely astonished by her. "You spoke to the commissioner last month," he said. "He came in with a kidney complaint. One tends to talk while waiting for the pain to subside." Stephen made the sound that was not quite a laugh but always felt like one, the sound of genuine delight that she had come to think of as one of the best things about being alive. "What did he say?" Stephen asked. "He said he thought it was a fine idea and that he would raise it at the spring session." She paused. "He also said that if Elsie Gentry Wells was behind it, it would probably happen whether the session approved it or not, which I took as a compliment." "It was a compliment," Stephen said. She turned to face him fully. His dark hair had a little silver at the temples now, the way it had been settling in for the past 2 years, and it suited him in the way that things that are genuinely earned suited a person, as evidence of a life fully lived. "We are going to build a hospital," she said. "We are going to build a hospital," he agreed. And then we are going to build whatever comes after that," he said. "Same as always." She leaned into him, briefly and completely, the way she had learned to be close to him over 7 years of building a life in the same direction, and he put his arm around her without ceremony, the way you do something that is simply part of how you exist. The creek ran on. The clinic stood solid on its foundation. The ranch stretched out in the October light, full and real and theirs. James Wells grew into a boy and then a young man who inherited his father's steadiness and his mother's precision, and who studied medicine with a seriousness of purpose that made Elsie quietly certain that the clinic she had built would outlast her by generations. Clara Wells grew into a young woman of such formidable intelligence and such complete comfort with her own authority that the men of the county learned early to bring their best arguments if they intended to disagree with her, which was advice that served them well. The hospital petition was approved at the spring session of 1891. The land was granted. The construction began in the fall, funded jointly by the Medical Society Foundation, a private donation from Dr. Culver, and a contribution from the Wells Ranch that Stephen had designated in the account simply as community investment, which was the most accurate possible description. The Sable Creek Community Hospital opened its doors in the spring of 1893, on a day when the snow had just gone, and the land was that specific shade of new green that only happens for about a week before it deepens into summer. Elsie stood in the doorway and looked at the building that had been, 10 years before, the idea of a woman that most of the frontier had counted out, and she felt the kind of satisfaction that does not need to announce itself because it is entirely complete. Stephen stood beside her with James on his shoulders because James was 8 and still young enough to consent to this, and Clara in his arms because Clara was 6 and had decided she wanted to be there but also wanted to be held, which was the kind of decision she made by simply expecting that it would happen and finding that it usually did. "Is it what you wanted?" Stephen asked her. She looked at the hospital. She looked at her husband and her children. She looked at Rosa and Hector Ruiz arriving with Miguel, and the 3 smaller Ruiz children who had come into the world in subsequent years, with Elsie's hands and expertise, and the kind of care that transformed a medical procedure into something that felt, from the inside, like being held by the best version of what the world could be. She thought about the night she had walked into the saloon and put the contract on the bar, and told a man she had met only briefly that he was going to listen to her plan, because the plan was the right one and the only one, and she had built it on 2 sleepless nights and everything she knew. She thought about the creek line and the October morning and the hospital petition and the paper in the British Journal, and every baby she had caught with her hands, and every mother she had kept alive, and every letter she had written, and every argument she had won because she was right and she had the data to prove it. She thought about Stephen's voice saying, more than almost anyone I have ever met, on the night in the hotel dining room when the coffee went cold between them and neither of them moved to do anything about it. "Yes," she said, "it is exactly what I wanted." He shifted James on his shoulders and took her hand, and James from above said, "Can we go inside now?" And Clara said, "Yes, I want to see everything," and Elsie laughed, a full and genuine laugh, and pushed the hospital doors open and led her family inside. Behind them, Sable Creek went about its morning, the general store opening and the bank logging its first deposits, and the school bell ringing 2 streets over, and the whole persistent ordinary business of a community that was, in its daily life, quietly and permanently better for the fact that a woman had come here 7 years ago with 2 mules and a trunk full of instruments and the absolute refusal to be counted out. The frontier had needed her. She had needed it. And somewhere in the beautiful, difficult middle of that exchange, in the space between a contract on a bar and a hospital door swinging open, 2 deliberate people had built something that was worth every year of the building. The creek ran on. The clinic stood. The hospital opened its doors. And Elsie Gentry Wells, midwife and frontier physician, walked forward into the day with the same certainty she had always carried, clear-eyed and direct and exactly herself, beside the man who had never once asked her to be anything less.